Japan made the attack on the Hawaiian Islands on Sunday, December 7th, with submarines as well as airplanes. That was Sunday, December 7th. Japanese envoys were still making peace overtures in Washington 3 hours and 40 minutes after that attack began. And the United States Navy communique number 10 is just in. Enemy operations over the island of Luzon in the Philippines continue. Operations on the ground are continuing in Manila and northwest sections of Luzon and in the vicinity of Legazpi in southeastern Luzon. There is nothing of importance in other areas as of 9:30 a.m. today. So says the United States Navy communique number 10, just in. This is the NBC newsroom. A special message to the Congress in which the President placed on the records the events leading up to our war in the Pacific. For all history to read in amazement, in sorrow, in disgust. Those are the President's words. In that record, the President sets down the chronology of Japan's perfidious peace negotiations with us, those suave smiles and honeyed words that exploded with a bang Sunday, December the 7th at Pearl Harbor. The history highlights the deterioration of peace in the Pacific through the visit of Special Envoy Kurusu. On Sunday, December the 7th, an hour after the Japs had struck at our base in Hawaii, Kurusu and Ambassador Nomura were in the State Department delivering a message to Secretary Hull, a message that was full of expressions of peaceful ties. The message from the Japanese government said that the Japanese Emperor himself had long cherished the desire for the establishment of peace in the Pacific. An hour before, Japanese planes and undersea craft had struck, and at least 1,500 Americans were dead, and as many more were injured there in Hawaii. Incidentally, that's the first time we've known that the Japs used submarines as well as planes in their attack. The attack began at 1:20 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on Sunday. The two Japanese envoys were at the State Department with their message, and then 3 hours later, and this is a new disclosure too, 3 hours later, the Japanese premier himself telephoned Ambassador Grew, our man in Tokyo, that he wished to express for the Emperor of Japan his gratefulness for the cordial message from the President of the United States. And by that time, Hawaii was counting her dead and wounded. In the President's words, there is the record for all history to read in amazement, in sorrow, in horror, and in disgust. And the President adds, we are now at war. We are fighting in self-defense. We are fighting in the defense of principles of law and order and justice against an effort of unprecedented ferocity to overthrow those principles and to impose upon humanity a regime of ruthless domination by unrestricted and arbitrary force. The President also sent to Congress his message on Lend-Lease aid, reporting that such aid to the 33 countries who are America's allies totaled nearly $1.33 billion through November 30th. A little less than half of that amount represents actual exports. The total amount voted is $13 billion, approved by Congress to date. And the President announced today also that he had nominated Major General Henry H. Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, for temporary promotion to the rank of Lieutenant General. General Arnold's name heads a list of 15 officers sent to the Senate by the President and recommended by him for advancement. The Secretary of the Navy, Knox, he's just returned from Hawaii, has promised to make a statement this afternoon, and NBC will bring news of that statement to you just as soon as it's available. And the War Department issued communique number 10, saying that air operations over the island of Luzon in the Philippines and ground operations there were in progress over 3 sections of the island. The communique said that there was nothing to report from other areas. The House Naval Affairs Committee has passed a naval construction program calling for only 150,000 tons. At first, the Navy had asked for 900,000 tons, but Chairman Vinson of the House Naval Committee says the figure was cut at the request of the Navy itself. Vinson says the House cut eliminates all plans to build battleships, at least for the present. But Vinson added, this does not mean we're abandoning the idea of battleships. It just takes longer to build them. Secretary of State Hull has refused to make any comment on declarations of war against the United States which have been made by Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Hull says they're too contemptible to warrant serious comment. Competent observers in London say that the Japanese may already have cut across the Malay Peninsula north of Singapore and reached the sea on the other side. That would sever land communications between Singapore and British Burma to the north, if it is true. Japanese attacks on Hong Kong are forcing the British back to the defense of the island itself. The Japs have set up big guns in captured Kowloon, Hong Kong's section on the mainland of China. The British say withdrawals are according to plan, however, and the Chinese are still ripping at the Japanese flank and rear from the mainland, trying to relieve the British. In Malaya, the British acknowledge that the Japanese gained some ground, but the situation in that jungle country is described as confused. In Russia, the Soviets are still driving the Germans back, turning their gains all the way from Leningrad to the Black Sea into a general offensive. And that's all from the NBC newsroom. We take you now to San Francisco.
For this morning's Far Eastern story, we take you now to Batavia. Ladies and gentlemen, we regret that we cannot contact Batavia at this time, but here's the latest Far Eastern news from the San Francisco newsroom. The War Department of Washington said today that enemy air operations continued over Luzon and the Philippines, and ground operations were in progress in the three sections of the island. A brief communique said there was little to report from other areas, omitting mention of Hawaii and the United States Pacific coast for the first time in several days. Outlining the military situation, the communique said, the Philippine theater, that enemy air operations over the island of Luzon continue. Operations on the ground are continuing in the north and northwest sections of Luzon and the vicinity of Legazpi in southeastern Luzon. There's nothing to report from the other areas. The ground operations mentioned presumably were near Apari on the northern shore of Luzon, where Japanese troops made a landing early in the invasion, and it began some 200 miles north of Manila on the west coast, where the Japanese have gained another foothold. The landing made at Legazpi, about 220 air miles from Manila, late last week, was effected without opposition, the War Department disclosed. U.S. bombers and Dutch submarines made the strategic South China Sea a zone of deadly peril for Japan, chalking up a week's bag of 10 enemy transport or supply ships sunk and 5 more badly battered. The small marine garrison of Wake Island continues to hold out against Japanese assaults. The Navy announced 2 additional Japanese air raids on the tiny island outpost, cost the attackers 2 planes, and caused only inconsequential damage on the island. Japanese submarines are known to be operating in Hawaiian waters, the Navy said, adding that vigorous attacks are being made against them. Batavia had its 7th air raid alarm of the war when an unidentified bomber was sighted, but as in the previous cases, no aerial attack materialized. In San Francisco, 26 persons, the first civilians to arrive from Hawaii since the unprovoked Jap bombing that began the war a week ago Sunday, guarded their remarks today after arriving by Clipper plane. The 2,200-mile trip from the islands was uneventful. Morale is very good, reported Captain J.H. Tilton, pilot of the Clipper. Everybody is good and mad, and the blackouts are very black. Los Angeles traffic officers today were ordered to stop all cars with headlights dimmed with colored paint and cellophane. In issuing the order banning the colored lights, Deputy Chief B.R. Caldwell declared that in the event of a blackout warning, motorists must pull off the highway and switch off the lights. Thousands of motorists either painted their headlights or colored them with cellophane after Los Angeles' first blackout. Now, to get off of the war for just a moment, football officials on the West Coast are trying to figure out today what to do about the Rose Bowl game between Duke and Oregon State and the East-West game, both canceled for this region on New Year's Day. Definite suggestions have been made for the playing of the contests in other cities, but so far, no arrangements have been made. Now, this is NBC San Francisco Newsroom. We take you now to Washington.
This is Morgan Beatty in Washington. President Roosevelt has centered the attention of the capital on critical problems of the future by the simple expedient of reporting to Congress on the progress of Lend-Lease aid. As Don Goddard has told you, we have appropriated some $13 billion for aid to the Allies. But we have spent only $1.25 billion of that, and up to November the 30th, we have been able to ship out only $500 million worth of products. This report should have a sobering effect. It really tells us much more than the bare figures would indicate. It reveals that translating the will of Congress and the people from money into actual things is not a simple task. Few of us realize the fact that spending government money is a curiously complex job. It simply cannot be done rapidly, and it never has been done rapidly. The reasons for this are many. First, Congress writes restrictions on spending into such laws as the Lend-Lease law. Second, government agencies, including the Treasury, are restricted by law in the way they may issue money orders and permits. These are all checks to curb the spending scandals that have inevitably occurred in the past when large pork barrels have been opened. Besides all these pieces of necessary red tape, there is the larger question of production, that is, getting the Lend-Lease material manufactured, put in packages, and aboard ships bound for Lend-Lease countries. When we think of things like this, we usually think of dollars being spent and immediately going out in the form of products. We must remember that haste often must be made slowly, and spending $1 billion worth of the taxpayers' money is a task requiring sweat and work and toil and time. It is not the flip of the wrist. Of vast import in the immediate future are the statements the President made when he transmitted this third Lend-Lease report to Congress at noon. Most significant is this paragraph. We are engaged in a total war against a group of Axis powers led by Nazi Germany and bent on world domination. Their strategy is worldwide. Ours also must be worldwide. That's the end of the paragraph. Reflected in that statement is the knowledge of our High Command that Japan's attack on us is a part of the Axis strategy. In other words, the Axis has developed some system, as yet undisclosed, to handle mutual problems and to control mutual policies and strategy. In short, they are using some sort of Axis High Command. It may well be, and I am not reporting any inside stuff because I don't have any, but it may well be that the President is acknowledging in that paragraph the future need of the Allies for some central board of strategy, an Allied High Command. Only it is quite obvious that a restricted military high command, like the one of World War days, will not be sufficient. No General Foch can keep all the threads of total war in his hands, nor even in his mind. It is physically impossible. Any high command designed to fit this war must have all kinds of struggles in mind, economic, military, diplomatic, propaganda, for this is a war on all fronts. The President's Lend-Lease message today also raises again the question of aid to Russia. Since we are now at war with the whole Axis, we are committed to aid all our allies. But at the same time, we must arm ourselves adequately. Any government that fails to give our armed forces what they need as promptly as possible would be in a dangerous position in a short time. And yet, as the President points out, we must let Britain, Russia, and China, and other nations use the weapons from the arsenal of democracy so they can be put to the most effective use. There's the heart of the problem, the most effective use. Who is going to say who gets what aid first? A central board of strategy would give the best answer, but at the moment there is no such allied board or command. Doubtless the Axis powers thought of that when they decided the time was ripe for the attack on the United States. For we must now decide where we're going to place our limited war production. Limited because our industrial machine is not yet rolling all out for war. In this connection, observers here are keeping Russia high on the list. The Russians are holding the large bulk of the German army on their front. They have suffered the most in this war. In view of this fact, it is reasoned by close observers that Russian morale needs a boost this winter. Not a mere gesture of help, but a real industrial shot in the arm that will prepare the Russian army and people for a fight to come next spring. Unquestionably, these things are crowding in the background here, and they played their part today when the President told Congress that our strategy must be worldwide, and we must continue to aid the Allies, and we must put that aid where it will do the most good. Strong signs are appearing on the military strategy front in the capital. The watchword seems to be accent on air strategy. The President has just nominated Major General Henry H. Arnold, the Chief of the Army Air Forces, for a temporary promotion to the rank of Lieutenant General. Arnold's name headed a list of 15 officers whose names have just been sent to the Senate for advancement. Up on Capitol Hill, the House Naval Affairs Committee has voted to add another 150,000 tons to our two-ocean Navy, which is still largely in a blueprint stage. But when the bill was originally drawn a week ago, it called for a naval increase of 900,000 tons. The Navy itself has come forward to cut down the tonnage. Chairman Vinson of the House says there are no new battleships in this bill, but it takes a long time to build battleships. The chairman apparently wants to scotch hysterical thinking about naval strategy, thinking based on the confirmed destruction of 4 capital ships in the first week of the Battle of the Pacific. We can conclude from all this that the Navy may be revising its building program, but we can't tell just how yet. That's all for now.
NBC is brought to you up to the minute on the news. You have heard Don Goddard speaking from New York, late news from San Francisco, and Morgan Beatty from Washington. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
From 10 to 11 tonight, there will be broadcast the most important program celebrating the Bill of Rights. And during the program, President Roosevelt will deliver an address. Be sure to listen. WEAF, New York.
Secretary Knox says that the United States Navy lost 6 vessels, 91 officers were killed, and 20 officers wounded. The enlisted men casualties were 2,600 killed and 630 wounded. Japanese material losses were 3 submarines, one of which was captured, and 41 aircraft. The losses to the Navy included the battleship Arizona, the old target ship the Utah, and 3 destroyers, the Cassian, C-A-S-S-I-A-N, the Downs, D-O-W-N-E-S, and the Shaw. A mine layer, the Oglala, O-G-L-A-L-A. In regard to fifth column activities, the Secretary said they were the most effective fifth column activities of the war with the exception of Norway. Secretary of the Navy also declared that the United States military services in Honolulu and in Pearl Harbor were not on the alert against the surprise attack by the Japanese. This report came to you from the NBC newsroom.
Once again, we present Mary Noble, Backstage Wife, the story of a simple small-town girl who married...
Meantime, United States Army losses were severe in aircraft and some hangars. The War Department says that Army casualties in Hawaii, that first day, total 168 killed in action, 223 wounded, 26 are listed as missing. But, says Secretary Knox, the entire balance of the American Pacific Fleet with its aircraft carriers, its heavy cruisers, its light cruisers, its destroyers, its submarines, is uninjured. The balance is uninjured. All are out at sea seeking contact now with the enemy. In other words, those losses at Pearl Harbor are not as bad as some members of Congress thought they were. And while it's admitted that we were surprised that this fact will be investigated by the President, at the same time, once we began to fight, we fought bravely and well. That's the verdict of Secretary Knox. A verdict, by the way, that includes some disquieting factors that we didn't expect. However, for instance, Mr. Knox says that in Hawaii there was fifth column work by the Japanese on a scale nowhere exceeded during the whole war except perhaps in Norway, where the Quislings sold out. Knox said that from 150 to 300 planes participated in that first attack on Pearl Harbor, a formidable force attacking a sleeping garrison. But Knox says that in spite of this circumstance, the Pearl Harbor dry docks, oil storage tanks, and important base facilities all escaped damage. Late this afternoon, the Navy communique revealed that a Norwegian motor ship was sunk while approaching the Hawaiian Islands. But otherwise, the communique says the Hawaiian area has been without incident. Meantime, Wake Island and Midway Island continue to resist Japanese landing attempts. In the North Atlantic, heavy weather is impending naval operations. That implication, of course, that official statement is interesting because it indicates that operations are or have been going on not only in the Pacific, but in the Atlantic as well. But so far, there's only silence from the Atlantic. The big things are still happening out there in the Pacific. In the Philippines, Japanese raiders again bombed Nichols Airport just outside of Manila today, but the invaders' activity is being confined almost entirely to the air, according to Army headquarters in the islands. Unofficial reports say that Japanese troops at the city of Vigon, that's on the western coast of Luzon Island, have sent out patrols. But there's no mention of Japanese activities at Apari in northern Luzon, and the Army says that our planes damaged 2 Japanese transports at Legazpi, that's southeast of Manila, to check the arrival of reinforcements from Tokyo, Japan. The official Army comment on the situation on the land is that our troops are holding the Japanese invasion forces at all 3 points, at Vigon, at Apari, and at Legazpi. A summary of official reports on the fighting in the Philippines shows that at least 40 Japanese planes have been destroyed, that 4 Japanese transports have been sunk, together with 2 Japanese battleships. 5 more transports have also been damaged. But behind the Philippine front, meanwhile, the drive against fifth columnists continues. 2 Japanese have been seized near Manila with homemade bombs and dozens of maps. At Army headquarters in Manila, the suggestion was made today that the American flag be taken down so that the stars and stripes would not serve as a guide to the enemy raiding planes. General MacArthur says, let's keep the flag flying. On the British sectors of the far-flung Pacific front, the news is not good this evening. British headquarters at Singapore admit a fierce Japanese push into the Malayan Peninsula. a drive by the men of Tokyo that has forced the British back as much as 50 miles at some points. Fighting is now going on in southern Kedah, a state on the northwestern side of the Malayan Peninsula. The official British communique says that the situation is somewhat confused, but the Japanese advance is admitted. The Japanese push began in southern Thailand near the city of Singora, the city that is connected with Singapore by a railway and a main road which stretches on down the western coast of Malaya. The Japanese are using armored equipment and planes along with troops in that push toward the vital British base of Singapore down to the south. A coordinated offensive, much in the German manner. To gain a sea base within easy reach of Singapore, the Japanese have also been bombing the island of Penang. Possession of Penang would give the Japanese an important base from which to attack British shipping in the Straits of Malacca, that's between Singapore and Rangoon in Burma. The British are facing the same kind of danger at Hong Kong as they are at Singapore. The Imperial troops on the Kowloon Peninsula are withdrawing in the face of superior Japanese strength. The official word from London is that this withdrawal of the British is methodical, but there's no attempt to deny that the withdrawal has taken place, is still going on tonight. A British news agency dispatched from Singapore says that Kowloon is unquestionably in Japanese hands, and a later communique from Singapore says there's no further news from the Hong Kong front. However, although it seems fair to assume that the British are withdrawing from the Kowloon Peninsula onto that island of Hong Kong, there is some doubt about Japan's immediate chances of taking that British stronghold. Hong Kong has been strongly reinforced in recent months. There's nothing in British dispatches to indicate that the defenses of Hong Kong are crumbling in the face of the intense Japanese attack. Say, here's something that happened today right here in America. Say, suppose you tell about it, Ray.
Today, over 1 million people walked up to candy counters, reached in their pockets for a nickel, and said, "I'll have a bar of Peter Paul's Mounds, please." Yes, every day over 1 million people enjoy this delicious chocolate coconut candy bar. When you have your first bite of Mounds, you'll know why. Coconut so tender and creamy, every bite melts in your mouth. And that coconut covered with rich brown chocolate. Try one and you'll agree there's nothing quite so mouth-watering as chocolate coconut Mounds. And now, back to George Putnam.
In the Mediterranean Sea, 2 large Axis supply ships have been sunk. Half a dozen smaller Axis vessels have been damaged. That's the official word from the British Admiralty, and with it goes the explanation that the Germans and Italians are trying desperately to reinforce their North African front, shipping men and supplies into North Africa as fast as they can in order to bolster their sagging front in Libya. The British seem to think that they're sinking these men and supplies just about as fast as the Axis can dispatch them from Italy and Greece. And there are plenty of indications that these reinforcements are desperately needed by the Germans and the Italians on the Libyan desert. The British report from Cairo that the Imperial armies are slowly closing in on the retreating Nazis in a pincer movement, that the gap is so narrow tonight that the Germans have been forced to throw everything they've got into a delaying action. The Imperial 8th Army is said to have engaged the Axis rear guard in battle 48 hours ago. Preliminary reports say that this battle is being fought in a heavy rain on a front extending from Gazala on the coast to a point as far south as Trigel Abd in the heart of the Libyan desert. Informed quarters in London say that the Axis is now trying to hold a front in Libya, while reinforcements can be rushed up to keep the British out of Tripoli, thus to prevent the Imperial armies from taking up positions along the Tunisian frontier of French North Africa. That speculation ties in solidly with the belief current in Washington that Adolf Hitler is going to attempt to push down the west coast of Africa this winter, a push to new positions menacing the western hemisphere. This drive across the Mediterranean through Morocco to Dakar on the African west coast would definitely be menaced if the British were allowed to continue their drive across Libya. The Imperial armies would act as a knife being driven into the lifeline of Axis supply, the very lifeline of this new West African expedition, which many believe the Axis is now considering. 2 things happened today which support the belief that Adolf Hitler is looking for a diversion from his Russian war. In Berlin, representatives of Germany, Italy, and Japan met in special session. The tripartite powers are going to decide on common measures to be taken in the war against Britain and the United States. Now, one of those common measures might be this West African drive of which we just spoke, a drive through Spain and Portugal over the Straits of Gibraltar to Dakar. At any rate, there is news from Spain today that might support this view, the belief that Spain will be used as the new Axis pathway to Africa. The Spanish Transatlantic Company says that all sailings of Spanish merchant ships for North and South America are postponed by government order. The dispatch from Spain does not explain the significance of this move, but the Associated Press points out that the cancellation of ship sailings is a signal of a change in a country's status with regard to the war. Right here in New York, there was immediate reaction to Spain's move with regard to shipping. The Spanish steamship de Tenerife was detained today by the combined action of the Coast Guard, Naval Intelligence, and Customs agents. Officials say that the Spanish vessel attempted to carry many parts of radio transmission and receiving sets, also a large quantity of lubricating oil, as well as $36,000 worth of silk. Now, all of these items were listed as ship stores on the manifest of the Spanish vessel instead of being declared as they should have been. While the world waits for Hitler's new feint in Europe, some new diversion, it's increasingly evident that the Nazis are in a tough spot in Russia. Moscow reports this evening that the Great Red Offensive is rolling on toward the north, that the Russians are battling to reopen connections between Moscow and Leningrad and to join the Central and Northern armies which were split by the Germans. The Soviets say that 42 new settlements in the northern sector have been overrun and retaken by the advancing Reds. Down on that southern wing of the Moscow offensive, Russian forces captured 32 other towns. The Germans are reported to be abandoning vast quantities of material in a retreat, which is described by the Russians in one word: headlong, a headlong retreat. London believes that the Nazis are definitely on the run, but it's expected that Germany will attempt to form a new line anchored at a point 300 miles northeast of Moscow and also in the south at Kharkov in the Ukraine. In Congress today, defense bills by the score went through the legislative mill on ball bearings. Both houses pushed the $10 billion defense appropriation bill toward final enactment. The House quickly adopted a joint conference report on the supply bill, which would provide the money for more tanks, guns, planes, and ammunition. Military committees on both sides of the Capitol worked long hours on draft legislation, and the House arranged to clear the decks for that bill as soon as the Senate committee approves it. The House committee has also already given its okay. At the same time, the Rules Committee opened the way for debate tomorrow on an omnibus bill that will reenact the World War Trading with the Enemy Act. Out in Chicago, a young man appeared in court today, complete with black eye, tattered clothes, wounded conscience. On top of all that, if that weren't enough, he was fined $200. The charge, disorderly conduct. But what really happened was that Edward A. Loss, Jr. booed a sound movie of President Roosevelt in a newsreel theater out in Chicago. Well, after the crowd got through with him, the court began. Mr. Loss told the judge, "I didn't know what I was doing." He said he'd been turned down by both the Navy and the Marine Corps because of his eyes, but he will go into the service gladly if he's drafted. Here in New York, Cupid is going to have to take to shelters, and the reason is that this city is having a marriage rush, a romantic blitzkrieg, as it were. 600 couples applied for marriage licenses during the last week. That's a new high for the year. 1/3 of the draftees for matrimony were soldiers, sailors, and prospective servicemen. Say, by the way, that Rose Bowl game is going to be played after all. Oregon State College and Duke University are going to meet at Durham, North Carolina, the home of Duke. Here's the weather forecast for New York City and vicinity. Tonight and tomorrow, fair and continued cold. And the temperature right now in Manhattan, 39 degrees.